The scent of lemon polish and old money was the first thing that greeted Sarah Jennings every morning. It was the signature fragrance of the Grand Belvedere Hotel, a place that clung to the ghosts of a bygone era with the same tenacity that Sarah clung to the fraying edges of her hope. At precisely 7:02 a.m., the crystal chandeliers in the hotel's opulent dining room, the Regent, would flicker to life, casting a golden, forgiving glow over the starched white tablecloths and gleaming silverware. For Sarah, it was another Friday, the start of the weekend rush, which meant another 12-hour shift spent gliding between tables on aching feet. It meant another day of balancing trays laden with porcelain, of deciphering the cryptic desires of the wealthy, all for a wage that evaporated almost before it hit her bank account. The real weight, however, wasn't the physical toll of the job. It was the silent, slow-motion crumbling of the most important person in her world, her mother, Eleanor. Eleanor, who had once been a vibrant history professor with a mind as sharp as a tack and a laugh that could fill a concert hall, was now adrift in the fog of Alzheimer's. Each day, Sarah watched as the disease stole another precious memory, another piece of the woman who had raised her alone. Eleanor was in a specialized care facility, Whispering Pines, a place that promised dignity and expert attention at a price that was methodically bleeding Sarah dry. A crisp, cream-colored envelope lay on her small kitchen counter at home, a polite but firm notice from the facility, a 10% rate increase, effective the 1st of next month. It was a demand for a sum of money she simply did not have. "Jennings, Table 4 has been waiting for their water for 90 seconds. The Belvedere standards are measured in seconds, not minutes. Let's try to remember that, shall we?" The voice, smooth yet laced with acidic condescension, belonged to Mr. Alistair Harrison, the hotel's general manager. He was a man who wore his tailored suits like armor, and whose ambition was to one day see his own reflection in the polished marble floors without any imperfections. The hotel's century-old rulebook was his Bible, and he wielded it with the unyielding fervor of a zealot, stamping out any spark of individuality that dared to flicker among his staff. "Yes, Mr. Harrison," Sarah replied, her voice a carefully calibrated instrument of placid obedience. She procured a chilled water pitcher, her movements a ballet of efficiency honed over 5 years of service. Years of this work had taught her to erase herself, to become a pair of hands, a pleasant smile, an unobtrusive presence. The breakfast rush was a familiar storm of hushed conversations and the delicate clinking of silver on china. Eggs Benedict, fresh squeezed orange juice, croissants flown in from a boutique bakery in Paris. Sarah moved through the tempest with a serene, detached grace, her mind a frantic abacus of calculations. The care facility's new monthly bill is $7,260. My rent is $1,800. My paycheck covers less than half of that. The numbers danced and swirled in her head, a dizzying choreography of debt and impending doom. Her only real confidant at the hotel was Maria, a housekeeper in her late 60s with hands gnarled from decades of work and eyes that saw everything. During a rare moment of quiet, Maria found Sarah refolding napkins in a small service alcove. "He's on the warpath today," Maria murmured, her gaze flicking towards Harrison, who was inspecting a wine glass for smudges with the intensity of a diamond cutter. "Heard he got an email from the corporate office about a new ownership transition. He's terrified the new boss will find a single thing out of place." Sarah managed a tired smile. For him, a napkin folded at a 91-degree angle is a fireable offense. "You look exhausted, Mija. How's your mama?" "The same," Sarah said, her voice catching slightly. "She didn't recognize me yesterday. She thought I was her sister Rose, who passed away 10 years ago." She didn't need to say more. Maria, who cared for her own aging husband, understood the unique heartbreak of grieving someone who was still alive. For Sarah, that grief was a constant, physical weight in the center of her chest. It was around 10:30 a.m., as the last of the breakfast patrons were lingering over coffee, that it happened. A man had been sitting alone at table 9, a quiet, distinguished gentleman who appeared to be in his late 70s. He was dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored tweed jacket. He hadn't been demanding or fussy. He'd ordered black coffee and toast, read a well-worn paperback novel, and left a tip that was precisely, almost mathematically, 20% of the bill. Sarah had barely noticed him beyond his kind, crinkly eyes and polite smile. As she cleared his table, collecting the fine china and the linen napkin, her hand brushed against something cool and hard, resting inconspicuously beside the salt shaker. It was a fountain pen. It wasn't flashy or ostentatious. It was a deep, shimmering blue, almost the color of a twilight sky, with elegant silver trim. It felt solid, perfectly balanced in her palm. Her heart gave a little flutter of admiration. Her late father had collected fountain pens, and he had taught her to appreciate the craftsmanship, the history locked within such a simple object. Hotel policy, as dictated by Harrison in countless daily briefings, was absolute. Any and all items left by guests, from a stray glove to a diamond earring, were to be immediately logged with the front desk concierge and secured in the hotel safe. There were no exceptions, ever. Sarah glanced towards the front of the dining room. Mr. Harrison was now deep in a hushed but clearly intense conversation with the head chef, his posture rigid with disapproval. Turning in the pen now would mean interrupting him. It would mean a lecture about attentiveness, about how she should have spotted the item before the guest even left. It would mean filling out a detailed form in triplicate. It would mean enduring Harrison's self-important pronouncements on protocol and guest property security. "I'll just drop it at the front desk on my way to my break," she reasoned. "It will be faster, less of a production." She slipped the pen into the deep pocket of her black uniform apron, the cool, smooth barrel a foreign object against her thigh. She had every intention of turning it in. In 20 minutes, maybe 30 at the most, she would walk to the grand reception desk and hand it over. It was the right thing to do. It was the only thing to do. But in that moment, as she turned to reset the table for the lunch service, she had no idea that this simple, honest intention was about to set her life on a collision course with ruin. The weight of the pen in her apron pocket was a small but constant presence. Through the setup for lunch, the polishing of countless glasses, and the endless refolding of napkins, it felt like a little stone, pulling at the fabric of her uniform, pulling at the edges of her thoughts. Mr. Harrison's tense meeting with the chef had finally concluded, but he had immediately swept out of the dining room, his phone pressed to his ear, his face a mask of grim importance. Finally, the pre-lunch lull settled over the region. The vast room was empty, a silent theater of white linen and sparkling crystal waiting for the next act. Sarah slipped into the staff locker room, a cramped, windowless space that smelled perpetually of shoe polish and stale coffee. She needed a moment to breathe. Her heart was beating just a little too fast, an anxious rhythm she couldn't quite explain. Why? She hadn't done anything wrong. She was merely holding the pen until the appropriate moment to turn it in. Still, she had to look at it again. Curiosity, a powerful and sometimes treacherous force, gnawed at her. With fingers that trembled slightly, she pulled the pen from her pocket. Under the harsh fluorescent light of the locker room, the deep blue lacquer seemed to come alive, shimmering with an almost ethereal depth. It was a color you could fall into. She uncapped it. The nib was solid gold, intricately engraved with a small stylized letter, S. She noticed a maker's mark on the silver band around the cap. A name she didn't recognize, but that looked foreign, elegant. Mont Blanc? No, not quite. This wasn't just a nice pen. This was an exquisite piece of craftsmanship. Her father would have adored it. He would have known the make, the model, the year it was crafted. A wave of grief, sharp and sudden, washed over her. He had been her rock, her champion, and his slow decline from a sudden, aggressive cancer had been the first great tragedy of her life. Her mother's illness was the second. Her mind, conditioned by years of relentless financial pressure, made a sudden, unwelcome leap. A pen like this. What was it worth? $100? $200? To some people, that was a dinner bill. To her, it was a week's worth of groceries. It was the co-pay for her mother's neurologist. The thought was ugly, intrusive, and she tried to push it away. Before she could, a fellow waiter, Marco, strode into the locker room. Marco was young, ambitious, and carried a perpetual chip on his shoulder. He saw every colleague as a competitor in a silent, ruthless game for the best shifts and the most generous patrons. He saw Sarah's quiet competence not as a virtue, but as a threat. "What's that you got there, Jennings?" he asked, his eyes narrowing on the pen in her hand. "Pocketing a tip from a guest?" "It was left on table 9, Sarah said, her tone cool as she quickly capped the pen. "I'm taking it to the front desk." "Sure you are," Marco sneered, a disbelieving smirk playing on his lips. "You know Harrison would have your head if he saw you holding on to guest property. Section 12, subsection C of the handbook. Immediate dismissal." He recited the rule with a kind of smug satisfaction. He then opened his locker, grabbed his cigarettes, and walked out, leaving a trail of cynical disapproval in his wake. His words rattled her more than she wanted to admit. Now, simply walking to the front desk felt fraught with peril. What if Harrison saw her? He would assume the worst, just as Marco had. He would twist it into a story of her malfeasance. She needed to follow the procedure to the letter. She would fill out the form first, then turn in the pen. A clear, unimpeachable chain of custody. But first, the question still burned in her mind. What was it? She pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. She typed in a description: deep blue fountain pen, silver trim, gold nib with S engraving. The search results were a jumble of pen enthusiast forums and high-end stationery shops. Nothing matched exactly. She tried to decipher the maker's mark on the cap span. It looked like St. DuPont. She typed it in. The first result was an article from a luxury lifestyle magazine. The world's most exclusive writing instruments. Her eyes scanned the text. Then she saw it. A picture of a pen identical to the one in her hand. The headline read, "The St. DuPont Twilight Sapphire, a legend reborn." Her breath caught in her throat. The article described the pen in breathless prose. It was a limited edition, with only 10 ever made. The barrel was crafted from a rare Chinese lacquer mixed with meteorite dust, which gave it its unique, shimmering depth. The silver was solid platinum. The nib was 18-karat gold. It was considered a holy grail among collectors. Then she saw the number. The last one to come up for auction had sold for $175,000. $175,000. The number didn't seem real. It was an abstraction, a figure from a different reality. She closed her eyes, the phone feeling heavy in her hand. $175,000. It wasn't just a solution, it was salvation. It was Whispering Pines paid in full for years to come. It was the best doctors, the best care for her mother. It was a small apartment not constantly under threat of eviction. It was a chance to escape the suffocating weight of poverty that had been her constant companion for her entire adult life. It was a chance to breathe. Her mind raced, painting a vivid, seductive portrait of a different life. Who would know? The man was old. He was quiet. He was probably a wealthy tourist who had already forgotten the pen. The hotel staff, like Marco, would assume it was a cheap trinket. She could just walk away. She could sell it online to a private collector. No one would ever connect it back to her. She saw her mother's face, the flicker of confusion in her eyes, the fear that sometimes surfaced when she realized her own mind was betraying her. Wasn't her mother's peace of mind, her dignity, more important than the lost trinket of some anonymous, ultra-rich stranger? Her gaze fell back to the phone screen, to the picture of the pen. It was a beautiful object, a work of art. To sell it felt like a kind of violation. It was something that was clearly treasured. The quiet man at the table. He hadn't seemed like the kind of person who would be careless with something so valuable. He had a gentle, thoughtful air about him. Maybe the pen had sentimental value. Maybe it was a gift. Her own father's face flashed in her memory. He had one pen he treasured above all others, a simple Parker 51, not because it was valuable, but because her mother had given it to him on their first anniversary. He had used it to write every important letter of his life. After he died, Sarah had kept it. It sat in a box in her dresser, a tangible link to his love and his memory. Something inside her shifted. This object in her pocket wasn't just a pile of cash waiting to be claimed. It was a story. It was a piece of someone's life. To sell it would be to steal more than just its monetary value. It would be a desecration of whatever meaning, whatever memories were attached to it. She couldn't do it. The thought, which had burned so brightly with desperate logic just moments before, now felt monstrous. Her own struggles were immense, but they didn't give her the right to inflict a different kind of pain on someone else. Her decision solidified. She took a deep, steadying breath. The temptation had been a fever, and now it had broken, leaving behind a clean, clear sense of purpose. She would do the right thing, and she would do it by the book, leaving no room for doubt or accusation. She would go to Mr. Harrison's office. She would explain her discovery about the pen's value. That was important to show why she had been so careful, and she would hand it over. She pushed open the locker room door and stepped back out into the hushed elegance of the hotel hallway. Mr. Harrison was standing by the entrance to the dining room, his arms crossed, a thunderous scowl on his face. This was her chance. "Mr. Harrison," she began, walking towards him, her hand reaching into her apron. But before she could pull the pen out, before she could utter a single word of explanation, he turned his cold, furious eyes on her. And they were not just angry. They were alight with a chilling, triumphant cruelty. "Jennings, my office, now." The short walk to Mr. Harrison's office, a route she had taken a dozen times before for minor infractions, felt like a walk to the gallows. The air in the grand hallway seemed to crackle with tension. A few of her fellow waiters paused their work, their faces etched with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Marco was standing near the service station, polishing a fork with exaggerated slowness, a venomous, knowing smirk on his face. It was then that Sarah knew. He had gone to Harrison. Harrison's office was a monument to his own self-importance. The walls were adorned with framed certificates of achievement from hospitality management courses. A large, ornate mahogany desk was kept obsessively neat. A sleek, modern laptop sat on the corner of the desk, its screen displaying a four-way split of the hotel's security camera feeds. Harrison did not invite her to sit. He stormed behind his desk, his movements stiff with rage, and pointed an accusatory finger at his screen. "I have received a deeply disturbing report, Jennings. A report that, I must admit, I was not entirely surprised to hear." Sarah's brow furrowed. "A report, sir? I don't understand." "Oh, spare me the wide-eyed innocence. It's insulting," he sneered. "I was informed that you were seen pocketing a guest's property, and that you have been concealing it on your person for nearly an hour." He tapped his keyboard, bringing up a time-stamped image from the camera just outside the dining room. It showed her, just moments ago, walking down the hall. He then switched to another feed, this one from the hallway outside the locker room. "You took it into the staff area, away from the cameras inside. Why? To admire your prize? To see what you could get for it?" Sarah's head was spinning. The truth was becoming a nightmare of misinterpretation. "Mr. Harrison, that's not what happened. I found a pen on table 9. I was going to bring it straight to you, but you were busy. I took it to the locker room to secure it before bringing it to your office. I was just trying to follow procedure." "Procedure?" He let out a short, barking laugh that held no humor. "Procedure is to turn the item in immediately, not to hide it in your pocket, not to take it on a tour of the hotel's blind spots. Your colleague, Mr. Sanchez, was concerned enough to report your suspicious behavior. He is to be commended for his vigilance." Marco. The betrayal was a sharp, physical pain. "Sir, please, let me explain," Sarah pleaded, her voice trembling. She pulled the pen from her apron pocket and carefully placed it on the polished surface of his desk. "This isn't just any pen. I looked it up. It's incredibly valuable. I thought it was important to handle it with extreme care and to report the value to you directly. That's why I was being cautious." Harrison glanced at the pen with dismissive contempt. "Valuable? It's a pen. And even if it were the Queen's own scepter, it does not change the facts. You had it in your possession for 57 minutes. You took it to an unmonitored area. And now when you are caught, you concoct a wild, self-aggrandizing story about its value to justify your actions." He was twisting her honesty, her diligence, into a confession of guilt. "I have my phone," she said, her desperation mounting. "I can show you the website, the article." "I'm not interested in your internet fantasies," he snapped, his voice rising. "I am interested in the integrity of this hotel. I know your type, Jennings. Always quiet, always watching. I see the financial strain in your eyes. You thought you'd found a little payday, a way to solve your problems. The only reason you didn't walk out of the building with it is because Mr. Sanchez had the courage to speak up. Every word was a deliberate twisting knife. He was painting her as a common thief, and he was doing it with an air of righteous satisfaction. Her years of loyal service, the double shifts, the praise from guests she had accumulated in her file, it all amounted to nothing. In his eyes, her financial struggles were not a burden to be borne, but proof of a flawed character. "That's not true," she whispered, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. "In my professional opinion, it is the absolute truth," Harrison said, his face hardening into a mask of cruel indifference. "You violated the most sacred trust between a hotel and its guests. You have proven yourself to be a liability. We have a zero-tolerance policy for this kind of behavior at the Grand Belvedere." Zero tolerance. He was enjoying this. He was making an example of her. He probably saw a glowing commendation from the new owners in his future, a testament to his unwavering commitment to security. "Please, Mr. Harrison," she begged, the last vestiges of her pride crumbling. "I need this job. My mother, she's sick." "Your personal problems are of no concern to the management of this establishment," he said coldly. "Perhaps you should have considered your sick mother before you decided to become a thief." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, theatrical growl. "You are terminated, effective immediately. Collect your personal effects from your locker. I will have security escort you from the premises." The humiliation was a physical force, a hot wave that washed over her, leaving her dizzy and nauseated. He wasn't just firing her, he was branding her. He was having her marched out like a criminal. She stumbled out of his office, her vision blurred by tears she refused to let fall. Harrison followed her, speaking into his radio to summon security, his voice loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. The walk to the locker room was an eternity of shame. Guests in the lobby stared. Her co-workers averted their eyes, some with pity, others with a palpable fear that Harrison's wrath might turn on them next. Maria caught her eye from down a long hallway, her face a canvas of heartbreak and helpless anger. Sarah, unable to bear the sympathy, just shook her head slightly and kept walking. Two stoic security guards met her at the locker room. They stood arms crossed as she numbly emptied her small locker, grabbing her worn purse and a threadbare cardigan. They walked on either side of her, a silent, grim escort, through the opulent lobby, past the gilded mirrors that reflected her own shattered image, and out through the grand revolving doors into the harsh light of midday. The sounds of the city, the traffic, the distant sirens, a street musician's lonely saxophone, rushed in to meet her. She had walked into the hotel that morning worried about a rate increase. She was walking out now with no job, no final paycheck, and the false, filthy stain of theft clinging to her name. She had absolutely nothing. And as she began the long, numb walk to the bus stop, one question screamed in the terrifying silence of her mind. What in God's name am I going to do now? Arthur Sterling did not care about the pen's monetary value. The $175,000 it might fetch at auction was a rounding error in the vast, complex ecosystem of his finances. What he cared about was the memory the pen held. It had been a gift from his wife Isabel on their 25th wedding anniversary, just a year before cancer had taken her from him. She had saved for months to buy it. "For the man who has everything," she had whispered, placing it in his hand, "a way to write our next chapter." He had used it to sign every major contract, to write every personal letter ever since. It was his touchstone, his connection to the vibrant, brilliant woman who had been the architect of his happiness. He didn't realize it was missing until he was in a board meeting later that afternoon. He reached into his jacket pocket for it, a subconscious habit, and his fingers met only fabric. A quiet, cold panic, an unfamiliar sensation for a man who controlled a global empire, seized him. He retraced his steps, the office, the car, and before that, the hotel, the Grand Belvedere. He had recently acquired the Sterling Hospitality Group's parent company in a quiet, off-market deal. The ink on the contracts was barely dry. He hadn't been to the Grand Belvedere in decades, but he remembered it from his youth as a place of true elegance and impeccable service. This morning, on a whim, he had decided to visit incognito to get a sense of the place not as a new owner, but as a guest. His driver, a discreet man named Thomas, navigated the sleek black town car back through the city's snarled traffic. It was now 4 p.m., the tranquil period between the lunch and high tea services. As Arthur stepped out of the car and looked up at the hotel's grand facade, he felt a twinge of disappointment. The brass was a little tarnished, the doorman looked bored, and a faint air of complacency hung about the place. It had the bones of greatness, but the soul seemed to be missing. He pushed through the revolving doors, the lobby now quiet and sparsely populated. The manager, a man with slick-back hair and a suit that was just a little too tight in the shoulders, was standing near the concierge desk, smugly observing his domain. This had to be the man in charge. Arthur approached him. "Excuse me," Arthur said, his voice quiet but clear. "I had breakfast here this morning, at a table by the window. I'm afraid I may have left my fountain pen behind." The manager, Alistair Harrison, turned, his face shifting into a mask of professional concern. A complaint, or a lost item from a wealthy-looking guest, was an opportunity to showcase his managerial prowess. "A fountain pen, sir?" "Of course. Can you describe it?" "It is a deep twilight blue with platinum trim," Arthur said, his voice steady. Harrison's eyes lit up with the gleam of recognition and an unnerving amount of self-satisfaction. "Ah, yes. The pen. Found at table 9. We have it." A profound wave of relief washed over Arthur. "Thank heavens, it has immense sentimental value." "Rest assured, sir, your property is perfectly safe," Harrison said, puffing out his chest. "You were extremely fortunate. In fact, the pen was the subject of an attempted theft by one of our own staff members. But I personally handled the situation and neutralized the threat." Arthur's eyebrows knitted together. "An attempted theft? I beg your pardon?" "One of my waitresses," Harrison said, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial tone. "A woman named Sarah Jennings. She found your pen and, instead of following protocol, she concealed it. Took it into the locker room to assess her loot, no doubt. I was alerted to her suspicious activity by a loyal employee. I reviewed the security footage, confronted her, and terminated her employment on the spot. We run a very tight ship here at the Grand Belvedere. We have zero tolerance for such behavior." Harrison smiled, clearly expecting a flood of gratitude, perhaps even a handsome reward for his decisive action. But Arthur Sterling was silent. He was a man who had built an empire on his almost supernatural ability to read people. He could spot a lie in a multi-billion-dollar negotiation from 1,000 yards away. And something about this manager's story, his rehearsed jargon, his eagerness to be the hero, his casual vilification of a subordinate, felt profoundly, fundamentally wrong. "This waitress," Arthur said slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You are certain she intended to steal it?" "Without a doubt," Harrison confirmed, nodding emphatically. "Held on to it for the better part of an hour. A flagrant violation of policy. It's an open and shut case. But the important thing is, your pen is secure in the hotel safe. Allow me to retrieve it for you." He bustled off towards the back offices, a man thoroughly pleased with himself. Arthur stood by the concierge desk, a deep sense of unease settling over him. He looked around the grand lobby, at the faded portrait of the hotel's founder, at the table where he had sat just hours before, lost in memories of Isabel. He imagined a waitress, this Sarah Jennings, finding the most precious object in his life. He thought about the kind of quiet desperation that might lead a person to steal. But he also thought about the kind of smug, petty ambition that might lead a manager to destroy a person's livelihood just to appear competent to a new, unseen owner. Harrison returned, holding the pen aloft in a velvet-lined box, presenting it like a crown jewel. "Here we are, sir, safe and sound." Arthur took the box. He opened it immediately. The pen lay nestled in the velvet, its twilight blue lacquer gleaming. It was safe. He felt a moment of pure relief, and then his gaze sharpened as he looked up at Alistair Harrison, whose practiced smile was beginning to look brittle under Arthur's intense, unwavering scrutiny. "I would like to see the security footage," Arthur said. His voice was soft, but it carried an unmistakable weight of command that Harrison had likely never encountered from a guest before. Harrison blinked, thrown off balance. The footage, sir. But why? As I said, the situation has been handled. The employee has been dismissed. I'm sure she has, Arthur replied, his eyes as cold and gray as a winter sea. Show me the footage, now. A nervous sweat glistened on Alistair Harrison's upper lip. This was not how he had imagined this scenario playing out. He had envisioned himself receiving accolades for his swift, decisive protection of a guest property. He had not envisioned this quiet, imposing old man demanding to review evidence like some kind of detective. Sir, I can assure you it is quite unnecessary, Harrison stammered, wringing his hands. It's a simple matter of employee misconduct and— I am not interested in your assurances, Mr. Harrison, Arthur cut in, his voice dangerously calm. I am interested in the truth. I want to see precisely what transpired. My pen, your employee, your office, the monitor. Let's go. The command was irrefutable. Defeated, Harrison led the way to his office. He felt a growing sense of dread. Who was this man to be so persistent, so unnervingly authoritative? Inside the office, Harrison's hands shook slightly as he navigated the security software. Here it is, he said, gesturing to the screen. You will see. It is exactly as I described. The footage began to play. Arthur Sterling stood behind him, his presence seeming to shrink the already small room, his eyes locked on the grainy images. They watched in silence as the on-screen Sarah Jennings cleared table 9. They saw her discover the pen, the brief, gentle way she handled it, and then the moment she slipped it into her apron pocket. There, Harrison said a little too quickly. Concealment, the first and most critical violation. Arthur remained silent, his gaze fixed on the screen. They watched the next 57 minutes unfold. They saw Sarah move through the dining room with a quiet, professional grace. At one point, she helped a frail, elderly woman into her chair, her movements gentle and kind. She did not look like a thief plotting a heist. She looked like a tired, dedicated woman doing her job. Then they watched her enter the staff locker room, disappearing from view for several minutes. This is where she researched its value, Harrison narrated, trying to control the story. The only unmonitored area. Highly suspicious, you'll agree. When the on-screen Sarah emerged, Arthur leaned closer to the monitor. He saw it clearly, the resolve on her face, the determined set of her jaw. It was not the furtive expression of a criminal. It was the expression of someone who had wrestled with a difficult choice and had come to a firm, moral conclusion. She walked directly out of the hallway and towards the dining room entrance where Harrison was standing. The footage was silent, but her intent was clear. She was heading straight for him. Then the footage showed another waiter, the one Harrison had praised as a loyal employee, approach Harrison and whisper in his ear. Harrison's entire demeanor changed, his face darkening with anger. They watched him summon Sarah, cut her off before she could speak, and point imperiously toward his office. Finally, they watched the pathetic, humiliating dismissal. They saw Sarah being escorted out by security, her face a mask of shock and shame. The footage ended, leaving the image of the revolving door swinging shut in her wake. The office was silent save for the low hum of the computer. It is not, Arthur said, his voice a low whisper that carried the force of a landslide, as you described. Sir, with all due respect, the facts are clear, Harrison began, his own voice faltering under the weight of Arthur's stare. The facts, Arthur said, turning to face him, his eyes blazing with a cold fire, are that your employee found a lost item of significant value. The facts are that you were unavailable and then engaged in a lengthy public admonishment of your chef. The facts are that she took the item to a secure location, her own locker, while waiting for an appropriate moment to approach you. The facts are that she then attempted to approach you to do precisely that, and you, based on the whisperings of a jealous colleague, refused her the basic human decency of hearing her out. You did not give her a chance to speak before you accused, convicted, and summarily destroyed her reputation in front of her colleagues and my fellow guests. Harrison's face had gone chalky white. I was merely following hotel policy regarding theft. You were not following policy. Arthur's voice was now a low, menacing growl. You were indulging your own pathetic ego. You saw an opportunity to look decisive, to impress the new ownership you're so terrified of. You saw a struggling woman, and instead of offering her the benefit of the doubt, you saw her as a convenient pawn in your career ambitions. You didn't protect my property. You annihilated the character of an honest person. Harrison began to stammer a string of incoherent excuses about protocol and security and brand integrity. Arthur held up a single, silencing hand. I founded this company, Mr. Harrison, my wife and I. We started with one small inn. We knew every single employee by name. We built our brand not on zero-tolerance policies, but on a foundation of mutual respect and human decency, a principle you have clearly forgotten. The last bit of color drained from Harrison's face. He looked as if he had seen a ghost. You founded... My name is Arthur Sterling, he said quietly, and as of this moment, you are no longer an employee of Sterling Hospitality. Your termination is effective immediately. Have security escort you from the premises. He threw Harrison's own cruel words back at him, the irony thick and suffocating. Harrison stood frozen, his mouth agape, the carefully constructed world of his own importance, shattering into a million pieces around him. Arthur turned his back on the disgraced manager, picked up the phone on the desk, and dialed the extension for human resources. This is Arthur Sterling, he said, his voice calm and resolute. I require the personnel file and home address for one of your former employees, a Ms. Sarah Jennings. Sarah Jennings was sitting at her small rickety kitchen table, performing the grim ritual of the financially damned. The wood surface, scarred with the history of 1,000 hurried meals and anxious nights, felt cold and unforgiving beneath her forearms. She was staring at two pieces of paper, laid out side by side like death sentences. The first, a formal letter from her landlord, used cold, impersonal language to convey a stark threat. An eviction warning, its bold red letters screaming failure. The second, from her mother's care facility, Whispering Pines, was printed on expensive, cream-colored stationery that felt like an insult in itself. It politely, almost cheerfully, announced a rate increase that would tip her from barely surviving to actively drowning. They were two non-negotiable demands for money that, in her world, might as well have been for $10 million. She was adrift in a sea of impossible numbers, each digit a wave pulling her further from shore. The apartment was quiet, a fragile bubble of peace against the clamor of the city outside. The only sounds were the low, tired hum of the old refrigerator, a constant companion in her solitude, and the gentle murmur of the television from the adjacent living room. She had settled her mother Eleanor on the worn sofa, wrapped in her favorite Afghan. Today was one of Eleanor's good days. She was calm, her eyes clear and present. She was happily watching an old black and white movie, one she had loved in her youth, and the familiar dialogue was a soft, comforting backdrop to Sarah's silent panic. This quiet normalcy, this fleeting glimpse of the mother she remembered, was almost more painful than the chaos of her bad days. It was a stark, heartbreaking reminder of everything she was fighting for, and everything she was about to lose. Then came the knock. It wasn't the hesitant, papery tap of her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Gable, coming to borrow a cup of sugar. It wasn't the frantic, impatient rapping of a delivery driver. This was a firm, solid, three-part knock. Thump, thump, thump. It was a sound with weight and purpose, a sound that did not belong in the weary hallways of her rundown building. It was the sound of authority, and it cut through the fragile peace of the apartment like a thrown stone, sending a jolt of pure, ice-cold dread through her veins. Her first sickening thought was the sheriff. The landlord had made his final threat. They were here to serve the final papers, to tape the notice to her door, to execute the final act of her failure in front of all her neighbors. Or worse, it was an administrator from Whispering Pines, a person with a sad, practiced expression, coming to tell her in person that they could no longer care for Eleanor, that she had a week to find alternative arrangements. Her mind, already a maelstrom of anxiety, spun into a terrifying montage of homelessness and despair. Packing her mother's few precious belongings into boxes, the shame of walking away from the only home she'd known, the thought of them ending up in a sterile, impersonal shelter. Her hands, which had been resting limply on the table, began to tremble. She rose from her chair, her movements stiff and robotic, and crept to the door. Her socked feet made no sound on the worn linoleum. She peered through the peephole, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. What she saw made her gasp, a small choked sound. Standing in the dim, flickering fluorescent light of the hallway was the distinguished elderly gentleman from Table 9. The owner of the pen, the vague, formless dread of moments before shifted, coalescing into something sharper, more terrifyingly specific. Harrison. He must have followed through. He must have filed a police report, embellishing his cruel narrative of her attempted theft. This man, the victim, was here to press charges. The police were probably waiting just down the hall, just out of sight, ready to step forward once she opened the door. The image of being led away in handcuffs, of her mother waking from her movie-induced calm to find her daughter being arrested, was so horrific it made her feel faint, her knees weak. She had to face it. Hiding would only make it worse. Taking a ragged, shuddering breath, she unlatched the deadbolt, a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the silent apartment, and opened the door just a few inches. The security chain, a flimsy, pathetic piece of metal, was her only shield. "Can I help you?" The voice that came out was not her own. It was a thin, breathless whisper, stripped of all life and warmth. The man's face, seen up close, was etched with lines of weariness and a deep, surprising kindness that seemed to radiate from him. He did not look like an accuser. He looked like a man carrying a great burden. "Miss Jennings? Sarah Jennings?" he asked, his voice gentle and resonant, entirely devoid of malice. "My name is Arthur Sterling. I was a guest at the hotel this morning. I believe you found my fountain pen." Sarah flinched as if he had slapped her, the metal chain rattling with the sudden tremor of her hand. "I didn't steal it." The words tumbled out in a desperate, frantic rush. "I swear I didn't. I was going to give it to the manager, Mr. Harrison, but he wouldn't listen to me. He was busy, and then he wouldn't listen. I was just trying to do the right thing. Please, you have to believe me. My mother is here. She's not well." Mr. Sterling held up a hand, not to silence her, but as a calm, placating gesture that seemed to absorb her panic. "I know," he said. The two simple words, spoken with such quiet, unwavering conviction, stunned her into silence. Her frantic explanation died in her throat. He repeated them, his gaze direct and sincere. "I know you didn't, Sarah. I saw the truth." He paused, letting the words settle in the space between them. "May I please come in? I promise you I am not here to cause you any more distress. I am here to try and undo the terrible injustice that was done to you today." She stared into his eyes, searching for the trick, the trap, the lie. She found none. There was only a profound, resolute sincerity. Against every screaming instinct in her body that told her to slam the door and hide, she slowly, hesitantly slid the chain free. The metallic rasp echoed her own frayed nerves. She opened the door and stepped back, allowing him to enter her small, threadbare world. He stepped inside, and his presence, though quiet and unassuming, seemed to fill the small, humble apartment. He was dressed in a simple but exquisitely made cashmere coat that probably cost more than her car, and his leather shoes were polished to a soft gleam. They stood in stark, silent contrast to the faded floral wallpaper, the worn-out armchair with the carefully mended throw blanket, and the lingering scent of soap and worry. His gaze swept the room, not with judgment or pity, but with a deep, sorrowful understanding. He took in the stack of bills on the table, the small framed photograph of a smiling, vibrant Eleanor on the mantelpiece from years before her illness, the air of quiet, desperate struggle that permeated everything. "I have just come from the hotel," he began, turning his full attention back to her. "I demanded to see the security footage from this morning. I watched the entire event, from start to finish." He looked her directly in the eye, and she felt as though he could see right through to her soul. "I saw you find the pen. I saw you handle it with care. I saw you look towards your manager's office and see that he was occupied. And then I saw you attempt to approach him, with resolve on your face, ready to do the right thing. And I saw him refuse to let you speak. What Mr. Harrison did to you was a monstrous abuse of his authority. It was cruel, It was unwarranted, and it was a complete betrayal of everything my company is supposed to represent. And for that, from the very bottom of my heart, I am sorry." Sarah stared at him, bewildered, her mind struggling to process his words. Your company?" A flicker of pained irony crossed Arthur's face. "Sterling Hospitality. I founded it with my wife Isabel many years ago, which means that Mr. Harrison was my employee, acting in my name. The ultimate responsibility for his actions is mine." The revelation was so staggering it felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. Sarah stumbled backward and sank onto the arm of the lumpy sofa, her legs no longer able to support her. The quiet man from Table 9, the owner of the Pen, the owner of the Grand Belvedere, the owner of the entire hotel chain. The world seemed to tilt and spin, the dimensions of her small apartment warping around her. "Mr. Harrison is no longer with the company," Arthur stated flatly, his voice leaving no room for doubt. "But firing him does not pay your bills." He nodded towards the ominous pile of envelopes on her kitchen table. "And it does not help your mother." Tears, hot and sudden, welled in Sarah's eyes. After hours of holding them back, they finally spilled over. She could only nod, the words trapped in a thick knot of emotion in her throat. "Sarah," he said, his voice softening, becoming almost paternal. "In my long life, I have learned that integrity is the rarest and most valuable asset on earth. It is worth more than any stock portfolio, more than any skyscraper. Today, you were faced with a temptation that could have solved all your worldly problems in an instant. A temptation that I am sure felt overwhelming, that must have screamed at you to take the easy path. And you chose to do the right thing. You chose to protect a stranger's property, a stranger's memory." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a long, crisp business envelope. "This is not charity," he said, holding it out to her. "This is restitution. It is a long overdue bonus for an act of profound integrity in the face of extreme hardship. And it is an offer." Her hand trembled so badly she could barely take the envelope. The paper felt heavy, substantial in her numb fingers. She fumbled with the flap, her coordination gone. Inside were two documents. The first was a cashier's check made out to Sarah Jennings. When she saw the amount, her vision blurred and a soft roaring started in her ears. $250,000. It was an impossible, mythical number, a figure from a life she couldn't even imagine. She read it 3 times, convinced her exhausted, grief-stricken mind was playing tricks on her, that a decimal point was in the wrong place. "That," Arthur said gently, seeming to understand her shock, "is to settle your accounts, your rent, your mother's care, indefinitely. It is to provide a foundation, a bedrock of security, so that you never again have to feel the kind of desperation that forces such an impossible choice upon you. It is also compensation for the slander against your good name and the profound emotional distress you were forced to endure." The second document was a letter on heavy cream-colored stationery bearing the elegant Sterling Hospitality logo. It was a formal job offer. Her eyes scanned the page, her mind struggling to comprehend the dense legal paragraphs until they landed on the title, Director of Guest Experience and Staff Training, the Grand Belvedere Hotel. The proposed salary was a number she had never dreamed of earning in 5 years, let alone 1. And below that, a line that made her heart stop. "Full medical and dental plan for you and your designated family member, effective immediately." "I have a problem, Sarah," Arthur said, drawing her stunned gaze up from the page. "My company has grown large, but in the process, it has grown soulless. It is filled with men like Alistair Harrison, men who worship rule books but have no understanding of people, men who see numbers on a ledger, not the human hearts that beat behind the name tags. I need to fix that. To do so, I need someone at the heart of the operation to be my eyes and ears, someone to train the staff, to ensure that the core values of this company, empathy, dignity, and decency, are not just words in a manual. I need someone who understands, someone who has stood on the other side of that counter, someone whose character is, without question, unimpeachable." He reached into his pocket again and pulled out the twilight blue fountain pen. He held it not as if it were valuable, but as if it were a sacred relic. This was a gift from my late wife, Isabel, he said softly, his voice thick with memory. We started the first hotel together with nothing but a dream. She always believed you could judge the true character of a person by what they do when they believe no one is watching. Today, Sarah, I saw your character. It is honest, it is strong, it is true. He held the pen out to her. I want you to have it. No, I couldn't, she gasped, her hands flying up as if to ward off something too precious to touch. Please, he insisted, his eyes gentle but firm. Its monetary value is meaningless to me. Its true value, its sentimental value, is now magnified 1,000 times over, knowing it was in the hands of someone with your integrity. Let it be a reminder, a symbol of the new chapter for my company, and for you. He looked from the pen to her, a deep, pleading sincerity in his kind eyes. Please, he said, come and help me build a company that Isabel would have been proud of again. Sarah looked from the check that represented freedom from fear to the letter that represented a future she could never have imagined, to the quiet, sad-eyed billionaire who was offering her not just a lifeline, but a legacy. The crushing weight that had been squeezing the air from her lungs for years. The constant worry, the sleepless nights, the gnawing anxiety, finally, miraculously, began to dissolve. It felt like a physical unclenching in the center of her chest, a release of pressure so profound she could finally take a full, deep breath. The tears that had been falling in silent despair now flowed freely, but they were tears of shock, of release, of a gratitude so immense it felt as if it might split her heart wide open. The future, which just hours ago had been a dark, terrifying void, was now a wide, sunlit horizon. Her mother would be safe. They would be safe. She would have a purpose. In her moment of deepest humiliation, she had been seen. Her true character had been witnessed, and it had not only saved her, it had redeemed her entire world. A sob broke from her lips, followed by a watery, incredulous laugh. She looked at Arthur Sterling, the quiet man from Table 9, her accuser, her executioner, and now her savior. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she smiled, a real and radiant smile that reached her eyes and transformed her tired face. Yes, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion but clear as a bell. Yes, I would be honored.